You know, I usually sit here for like at least 2 minutes just... What is up, guys? So today we're actually going to be taking another versus of two separate Pokemon, trying to figure out how they compare to each other, if they play a similar role to each other, or if they should be used totally separate. Today we're actually going to be looking at Sealeo and Lapras, two Pokemon that up until doing the research for this video I kind of thought they were pretty much interchangeable. I'm not going to lie, Sealeo was a must pick for my team. I found a really decent Sealeo that maxes out at 1500. I was like, yes, I'm sold. I'll buy Body Slam. I'll do what I got to do to get it. But after this video, I'm kind of putting myself back on the fence. I don't know whether I should use Sealeo and go for that surprise pick, or maybe just stick to the Lapras because it's safe. So today, looking at Sealeo and Lapras, they both share the water and ice typing. Now, I'm not trying to be funny, I'm not trying to sound stupid, but ice and water and ice, they were classified differently. Now, there's not a difference, right? Both of these Pokemon carrying the same typings ends up meaning that we both have the same weakness, being electric, fighting, grass, and rock type are all going to be doing some super effective damage up against our subjects here. Now, we do carry two resistances as well, which do kind of make us interesting in this cup, being ice and water. We know that ice type is not the greatest, but a lot of the ice types in this cup also carry the water typing, and basically if you have access to a water type move, you kind of are in a favorable position, considering Steelix and Bastiodon and Pokemon of the like end up hating you for carrying that water typing. So, being that we do carry both the same typings, our moves and our base stats are really going to kind of be what separates us from each other and kind of figure out which one does better in what scenario. So in terms of Sealeo here, I ended up deciding to go with Powder Snow, Water Pulse, and Body Slam. Powder Snow being a great fast move, gaining tons of energy, getting us to our Water Pulse and our Body Slam super quickly. I figured Powder Snow would probably be the best thing to go with. Having access to Water Pulse, of course, is not nearly as good as Surf. If Sealeo had Surf, I think Sealeo would just be crazy with Surf. And lastly, having Body Slam is kind of a big deal for Sealeo. It actually is what secures a lot of the matchups that Sealeo has, even actually ends up securing a matchup against Lapras here. So Body Slam is definitely a must-have in my opinion. On the other side, we actually end up having Water Gun, Surf, and Ice Beam. So towards the end of my research here, I did switch out Ice Beam for Blizzard just to see how the numbers change. And honestly, they don't change too much. I mean, yeah, you do lose a couple of matches because you can't get to Blizzard as quickly as you can get to Ice Beam, but you don't end up dropping too many of those matches, which kind of is what ends up putting me back on the fence about Lapras. I don't have access to a Legacy Lapras whatsoever. No Ice Shard, no Ice Beam, no Dragon Pulse, no nothing. Therefore, I was kind of like, well, I don't have access to our Legacy moves, so probably just going to go with Sealeo. I definitely think if you're considering the same, if you have the same thought process that I do, definitely consider changing that and taking another look into Lapras with Blizzard, because it's not nearly as bad as I thought, at least. So, having access to Water Gun and Surf, of course, is stupid fast. It gets to that Surf really quickly, and being able to just spam Surf is pretty devastating. Being able to spam a water type move is a little bit better in this cup than spamming a normal type move, but hey, it does work for Sealeo, whereas Surf does work for Lapras. Now, on to our shield situations. So I do have all of our shield situations written up here, and you can kind of see all four scenarios. Lapras ends up winning every single one of these. 80% compared to 60%, 98% compared to a 96, 12% compared to 2%. You can really see that our damage output is just not anything near what Lapras's is here. And then lastly, 84% up against our 66%, so just... Lapras definitely takes the cake whenever it comes to our shield situation. He just ends up beating us in every single category if we're deciding to use a Sealeo here, which is kind of unfortunate. While Sealeo doesn't necessarily do as good as Lapras, it definitely can bring some of the matchups back. Considering that Sealeo can beat Lapras, it actually could be a really interesting pick to go like anti-ball meta in this scenario. Because we can actually end up beating Lapras, that's pretty good. Now the problem is that we end up having a harder time with some of the other ball members, and we'll get to that, So let's actually look at some matchups here. So in terms of entire typings, how well do we do up against an entire typing? Well, with Sealeo up against the steel types, we actually only beat 6 of those Pokemon. We only beat 6. Yeah, you heard that right. But the only one out of those 6 that's even like kind of meta relevant is Skarmory. Not really too big of a deal. Skarmory could make a surprise appearance for some, but probably not. If people are doing their research, they're going to know that Skarmory isn't nearly as sought after in this meta as he was in previous metas. On the Lapras side, we actually end up beating 17 of the steel types, which is huge. Some notable ones here are Bastiodon, Skarmory, Melmetal, and Steelix. The fact that we end up beating some of the big powerhouses in the steel category is huge. Steel is just, it's amazing in this cup. It's so hard to beat. Lucario falls into the steel category, Bastiodon falls into the steel category, Steelix falls into the steel category. They're big powerhouses in this meta, and the fact that Lapras actually ends up beating both Bastiodon and Steelix, I think is a pretty big deal. I definitely feel like it gets extra credit towards that more than Sealeo does. Moving on to our ice types here. So ice was kind of interesting considering that we do carry a big resistance to ice here. On Sealeo's side, we actually end up losing quite a few. Abomasnow, Frostlass, and yes, both Alolan Sandslash and Alolan Sandshrew. Yeah, you heard that. Alolan Sandshrew can actually end up beating Sealeo, which here again is interesting, but I don't think you should really prepare for that, as not many people out there are going to just say, hey, I have to use Alolan Sandshrew. On the Lapras side, though, we actually end up only losing to Sealeo and Abomasnow. So that's pretty huge. The fact that Abomasnow is in this list, kind of, I would almost not even worry about Abomasnow. I think everybody was super hyped up about the Razor Leaf last month, but I don't think many people are thinking about it this month. I don't think people are saying, oh, I gotta be using Abomasnow this month. When there's fire running rampant, I don't think people are going to jump straight to that. Now, if you were going like anti-meta, like straight up anti-meta, Abomasnow would be an interesting pick against some of these Pokemon. Very, very cool. And of course, losing to Sealeo as our Lapras there does kind of make this an interesting toss-up, because while Sealeo does lose to a few more Pokemon than Lapras does in most of our matchups, you can actually kind of be the anti-Lapras with a Sealeo. Next, moving on to dragons. Here is kind of why I thought, okay, let's go with Sealeo. Let's just completely wall out these dragon types, because Sealeo beats every single dragon in this cup. That's huge. Sealeo has a really favorable matchup against all of these dragons. It's huge. That's a big deal. Now on the Lapras side, it does really, really well against most of the dragons. The only one that ends up giving it some trouble is Kingdra, and that's because Kingdra ends up having a huge resistance to water, which, you know, that's kind of Lapras's mainstay until it gets to that Ice Beam. So you do end up having a little bit of trouble with Kingdra, but that's really the only one. Last but not least, moving on to Fire here. So Fire was kind of the one that I was like, I wonder how these Pokemon are going to do. Not too shabby. So Sealeo actually only ends up losing to 3 Pokemon here. Alolan Marowak, Ninetales, and Blaziken. So some pretty notable ones there. Alolan Marowak, he's going to kind of be out there. He's going to be kind of running rampant. He's one of those wild card Pokemon that I think some people saw in the beginning and said, I got to use it. People that may have not done a ton of research on him maybe might miss a few beats with his matchups, but I still think they're pretty confident in using him. Blaziken, of course, we already know Blaziken is a huge deal in this meta. He's able to take out a lot of the kings with just having access to counter, being able to farm a ton of energy off of just using counter. Saving up those charge moves for another matchup is a big deal. Now, Ninetales is kind of the wild card here. I don't foresee tons of Ninetales being thrown around out there, but it definitely could happen. As the meta progresses, people could be looking into Ninetales and saying, oh, Ninetales has an interesting package here. He does have a few moves that you can cover and use to basically cover oddball picks. He's kind of almost a nice Glalie type from the Tempest Cup. He does cover several things without really trying too hard. But he does have a pretty big downfall being only fire typing. He does end up having several weaknesses that are running rampant. But the fact that we end up losing to Ninetales is quite an interesting thing there. Now onto the Lapras side. Lapras ends up only tying up against Charizard. He actually ends up beating every other fire type except for Charizard, which is kind of an interesting one. I figured Charizard wouldn't have that big of a deal up against Lapras, but hey, being that you tie up against the Charizard is not too shabby. Beating everything else is pretty big. So really, you kind of just want something that can beat Charizard, and your Lapras basically beats all of the other fires. So not too big of a deal. Now, to the big point of the video, what should you actually be pairing these Pokemon with? Well, after looking at some of these matchups, I definitely actually feel like Flygon, even though we talked about him yesterday, I feel like he's actually a pretty solid pickup against these. So, being that Sealeo only ends up beating 6 of the steel types, Flygon can pretty much clear a lot of those steel types with its ground type moves. Same thing with Lapras, it's kind of a win more against the steel types, but it does really good also up against a lot of the other oddball picks in the meta. Remember how I was saying, like, Flygon doesn't necessarily like to fight the dragons, but he likes to use dragon type moves. He's a dragon that disguises as something different. He doesn't really like do great up against the dragons, but he does really well up against most other things, which is really a big deal because both Sealeo and Lapras do really well up against the dragons. Sealeo literally clearing every single one, and Lapras only having trouble with Kingdra really sets up Flygon to do pretty good with it as a paired set. Next, I tried to think of some Pokemon that kind of separate both of these, and it's really, really hard. Considering that we do carry the same typing on both of these, there's not a whole lot of variance in what you should really use, like, more so on Sealeo than on Lapras. It's kind of awkward, but I do feel like Dragonair would probably benefit more if you were using Sealeo than if you were using Lapras. Lapras having more access to water type damage than Sealeo means that Dragonair can kind of fall behind in using Aqua Tail. It's not as prevalent. Being that Sealeo has quicker access to ice type moves means that Dragonair can really come in as a backup and use its Aqua Tail to help push out a lot of that water damage. So that was one thing that I thought of. Then I started to think about Lapras, and I was just like, what? There's really like nothing that like Lapras can benefit from that Sealeo also doesn't benefit from. So then I just got to thinking, well, what's the one thing that just like hardcore counters Lapras? I bet you'd never guess. It's Lucario. So I got to thinking, okay, well, basically, since Lucario is a hard counter to our Lapras, we basically kind of want to use something that's gonna hardcore counter Lucario. So basically, anything that counters Lucario is a really, really good bonus with your Lapras. It's really nice to pair those two together. And then that got me thinking, well, is that the same thing for Sealeo? And actually, no, it's not. Because Lucario is a really hard counter to Sealeo as well, Bastiodon also comes up here. Because Sealeo doesn't have nearly as much water access as Lapras does with Surf, Sealeo kind of ends up having a hard time dealing with Bastiodon because it can use those rock type moves to clear us out a lot faster. You also need to think about something that's going to be able to beat Bastiodon as well. So really what you want to pair with Sealeo is anything that can counter either Lucario or Bastiodon. If you really want to use Sealeo, I think it's more of a let's build a team of 3, but you have to build it around Sealeo. And I think that's where it starts to lose a little bit of its touch for me, because Lapras, on the other hand, can hold a lot more on its own, and you only really have to have a Lucario counter rather than both a Lucario counter and a Bastiodon counter, because if you have a Lapras, you can choose Lapras and then one Lucario counter, and then have a wild card for something maybe that you're not for sure expecting something, so you want to throw Bronzong in there. Something like that. Something that's just a hardcore, like, wild card. Something that people aren't going to be able to really expect with this team of 3. So that's kind of the whole deal. I really wanted to choose Sealeo. I powered it up. I bought the second move. I was like, let's do this. I was gun-ho on it. And then I did this little versus match here, and just, I don't know. I really... Even switching from Ice Beam to Blizzard with our Lapras back here, I definitely feel like it's just as good. You're not going to be getting quite as many Ice Beams off. You're not going to be able to do quite as much ice damage. But as we've talked about, ice isn't as nearly as important this cup as water is, because water is really what is like clearing out a lot of the oddball steel types, the ground, the rock types, like all of those like secondary types that are carried in the steel typing are really going to get washed away whenever you use water. Unfortunately, Sealeo doesn't really have too much to work with in terms of water. It does have Water Pulse, and I even tried it with Water Gun, but unfortunately Water Gun just didn't have the same energy gain. It just wasn't performing nearly as well with Water Gun than it did with Powder Snow, so I just couldn't pass up using Powder Snow. It just needs that Powder Snow to get to these charge moves so much quicker. It's just so much more beneficial to try to use these charge moves than it is to try to use Water Gun. But that's just my findings. I'd love to hear what you guys think about these two beautiful Pokemon. I definitely do think they are both great in this cup. They both have merits, but I definitely do feel like Lapras is the easier one to put on a team and let it hold its own. Meaning, beings that you have to build the team around Sealeo kind of makes it a little bit more of a hassle, but it's definitely usable. I might just end up using Sealeo just to kind of use it. I powered it up. Do I really want to waste 75 rare candies on a freaking Lapras second move? Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I'll do that. But anyways, that's just my findings, guys. I'd love to hear what you guys think about these two Pokemon. Please let me know down in those comments below. And if you have any versus Pokemon that you're looking forward to, especially in the next cup, by the time you guys watch this video, the next cup may have already been announced, as it's supposed to be coming up this Wednesday. I think it's April 17th, if I'm not mistaken on my dates. Either way, if you're looking forward to a versus or a deep dive on any of the Pokemon in the current meta, please let me know. I'd love to look at them for you. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.